Good, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well and are safe and are taking care of themselves. On behalf of Ecological Diversity Cell, Department of English and Cultural Studies, Central Campus, Christ Deemed to be University, Bangalore, India, on the occasion of Earth Day, which is this year is the 51st anniversary of the celebration of Earth Day, we are honored to have a guest talk by Dr. Siddhartha Krishnan on conservation, a teach-in. For those who are a bit uninitiated, the teach-in concept is actually related to the very concept of Earth Day as it was started, I think, in 1970. A, a very brief introduction of Dr. Siddhartha Krishnan is as follows. He is an associate professor at Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, also known as ATREE, Karnataka, India, and is affiliated to its Center for Biodiversity and Conservation. He is the convener of ATREE's Academy for Conservation, Science and Sustainability Studies. His disciplinary and conceptual interests are in historicizing environmental sociology and sociologizing environmental history. He collects field and archival data to address questions pertaining to pastoral landscape and lifestyle transformations, human capabilities and ecosystems, services, environmental justice, and modernity and development questions as they pertain to food, pesticide use, and human health. He teaches sociology, environmental sociology, and qualitative research methods in ATREE's PhD program. He was a Carson Fellow from 2012 to 2013 at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, Ludwig-Maximilians University, Munich, Germany. Since April 2015, he is member of the executive committee of the Carson Society of Fellows. He was elected in April 2016 as a board member of the International Consortium of Environmental History Organizations. His most recent work is an edited volume published by Routledge, and it's titled Conservation Landscapes and Human Well-Being, Sustainable Development in the Eastern Himalayas. Very briefly, the book studies the well-being of the Eastern Himalayan forest dwellers in terms of their capabilities and functioning, and uses Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach. I'm looking forward to reading that book. And I hope we can get a copy of that in our libraries as well, so the students can read it too. It's going to be an interesting work. From what I was doing a little bit of research, and last year, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day was the biggest online mobilization. That's what Wikipedia claims, and I hope that claim is true. Today, we are in a situation where both climate change, ecological changes, and the very fact that we are living mostly in a virtual space working, question of talking on conservation becomes very important. And I am very sure that Dr. Siddharth is going to give us some insights of how to go about it. So whenever you're ready, Dr. Siddharth, we will begin. And it will be followed by a Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mithilesh, and thanks, Deepak. So a month ago, when Deepak called me and he said, Earth Day is coming, and we'd like to give you a talk, and that the Department of English, it also has a cell, ecological diversity. I was like so pleasantly surprised, right? Because besides my interests in sociology and history, I also have interest in environmental humanities. Before the pandemic kind of set in, me and some colleagues from the United States, we were hoping to have a workshop in Bangalore in 2020 on environmental humanities. We were drawing up a list of universities whose students from humanities and social science disciplines we could invite. But even though I think y'all don't call your department or your initiative, call it ecological diversity, it very well serves as a kind of environmental humanities initiative. And I'm going to end today's talk with a bit of an introduction to the environmental humanities, right? And yes, so I'm going to take a second or two to share a presentation. Mithilesh, we could just confirm to me that it's on the screen. Yeah.
Yes, it's opening.
All right.
It's here now. Yes.
All right. So I'm just going to switch to full screen mode. Just let me know if it works. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Mithilesh, you're muted. Can you see the full screen?
Yes, sir. It is.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Right. Yeah. So yes, conservation, teaching. Right now, I'm not here to talk to you today about the planetary crisis per se we face. Right. We live in an era of climate change, which means a lot of erratic atmospheric events and behavior, right? And our summers are getting longer and warmer. Our monsoons are getting very erratic. You have short, heavy spells of shower. We have snowfall around the globe during unseasonal times. Things are tough for fishermen, for pastoralists, for urban commuters, to farmers, just about everyone. And we're kind of learning to live with climate change, even as we watching with horror, a lot of inertia in among state actors and also corporate actors in not taking climate change seriously. And just when we were kind of, grappling with climate change, we've had the pandemic. And the pandemic is also, it has environmental roots, ecological roots. We all know that in certain provinces in China, there was a lot of wildlife trade, right? And the possible origins of the corona COVID virus is from pangolins and other mammals. But there are also conspiracy theories that it was a lab experiment which went wrong, right? But we're not talking about that. We are in a mess today. Now, I'm not here to talk about the biodiversity implications of climate change. We know, biodiversity, it could be species diversity, it is habitat diversity, it is genetic diversity, right? And it's very important for our food security, for our pharmaceutical security, right? And there's a lot of material online. You can Google for it about species loss and also the conservation crisis in India, because over the last 2 decades, we have lost lakhs and lakhs of acres of forests, which have been converted for other land uses, right? So those are facts and figures. I'm not going to talk about that. We know we have an ecological crisis. What I'm going to talk to you today about on Earth Day, and thanks, Nikhilesh, for pointing out to the fact, mine is a very political talk today. Because conservation is about politics. It's about power relations. It's about who is responsible very broadly for our environmental crisis, for our biodiversity crisis, for climate change, and who suffers because of it, right? So it's a justice question. When you talk about displacing forest dwellers from a protected area, whether you want to convert a forest for industrial uses or whether you want to kind of sanitize a protected area or a national park just for tigers and elephants, there are a lot of indigenous people who kind of suffer because of this, right? And we're also talking about climate justice these days. It's a question of environmental justice because the developed nations, they kind of emit a lot of their emissions are high, and poor people in Bangladesh and Sundarbans and in Sri Lanka and in the Coromandel coast of India, they suffer, right? So it's an environmental justice question, a question of disproportionate exposure to environmental risks. So it's a political question. So Earth Day, right, was what it was officially it was inaugurated in 1970, right? And one of the techniques that a Republican senator who one Senator Gaylord he used was the teaching, right? At that point of time, there was a lot of pollution in America, right? A lot of heavy industrialization. There was rampant automobile pollution. There was a lot of pesticide use in the agriculture sector. There was a lot of disease. There was a lot of water and air pollution, and a lot of ethnic minorities were suffering because of that. Now, Earth Day by itself may not have happened as an event if not for a book published in 1962 by Rachel Carson, right? The Silent Spring, right? So she noted that the birds were very silent in spring and something was wrong. And she wrote not just a scientific book, and I see a lot of English literature students will be sitting in today's forum. She wrote a book which actually worth Nobel Prize for Literature. Right? The language was so, she communicated science so brilliantly, right? And so the upshot of it, I think there was an international ban on the chemical DDT, which was polluting water. And given the food chain in America's ecosystem, it was affecting birds. And you didn't have robins singing and chirping in spring. And so it was the influence of her book, which led to a chain of events, which ultimately culminated in Republican Senator Gaylord's interest in American environmental future, right? And then he proposed a series of teachings. Now, what is a teaching? A teaching is a very political concept. The Rachel Carson was worried about DDT use in America. What the Americans were doing, they were spraying a country called Vietnam and also neighboring Cambodia with something called Agent Orange. Now, Agent Orange is a chemical which actually kills foliage and vegetation, right? And they were doing that from aeroplanes because they wanted to clear Vietnam's forests and paddy fields and vegetation so that they have a clear look at people and they can bomb people, right? And a lot of progressive voices in America, they were devastated by what America was doing. And there was this anti-war movement in the 1960s. Now, a lot of college students university students, very active. They were like, there was counterculture movement happening. There was an anti-war movement happening. And there was one professor Marshall Shallens. Now, he died 4 or 5 days ago. Right? Now, he is a world-renowned anthropologist. He proposed this idea of a teaching. A teaching was actually a political forum where the outdoors are indoors, experts and a cross section of people sit and talk to students, the youth, about the politics of war, right? About why war is wrong, right? And so it all started in the University of Michigan. And now about a decade later, it was Shallon's, teaching technique, which inspired Republican Gaylord in using that as a technique to communicate an environmental message to American citizens, right? So I'm using that as, an appropriate, timely kind of a political technique to talk to you today, right? About conservation and why conservation is political. Right, and yeah, so teaching, right, is a wartime political method employed during Earth Day, right? And on top is, on top of the frame is Professor Marshall Shallens, who passed away recently, and then to the right at the bottom is Republican Gaylord. And the Earth Day, I think, like your professor mentioned, I think it's the 51st anniversary. Wrong, and it's a very important, day to day, right? Because we are looking at multiple risks. We are looking at, there's climate change. There's also this pandemic, and in 2020 when the pandemic was raging, right? And I'm actually talking to you from the Nilgiris. I belong to the Nilgiris. I left Bangalore about a couple of weeks back to come stay with my parents because there was an election time. I had to vote And thank God, I kind of was able to get away. But my support and solidarity to all of you who are in Bangalore, and Bangalore is experiencing a stressful situation, right? So we're looking at planetary emergencies, we're looking at climate change, and experts tell us that the COVID virus is not going to leave us. I was reading something today that it will become an influenza-like flu, and it will be with us as just like cold and cough, right? And we need to adapt to it. So multiple risks our planet is facing, right? Now, having said that, so a teaching, right? A teaching on conservation today, and usually a teaching is not a monologue, it's a dialogue. And I encourage students to stop me at any point of time and ask me questions. But also Deepak told me it's a big audience today, and the questions will be, they'll kind of, people type in their questions, right? But if you have something very urgent to say, please stop me and we can talk about it. Because interaction, it's not, ecology is about interaction. Conversations around conservation need to be an interaction. Now, in today's story, in today's conservation conversation, right, here are the plot points, right? And I think most of you are English literature students and PhD scholars. I also heard that you have triple major students amongst you, right? So from what I know, triple major combinations are typically in economics and sociology and psychology. It could be English also, right? So a lot of you have interests in English literature, right? So yeah, I think you'll have courses in book writing and film script writing, right? So we have plot points. Let me use that today, plot points. So what are the plot points today, right? The first is we're going to talk about the environmental history, right? Environmental history is a humanities discipline, right? It looks at how societies engage with nature in the past and what are the implications of the future, right? So the environmental history of conservation. When we talk about the environmental history of conservation, we're going to talk about an important watershed, which is conservation or official forest protection that the British institutionalized in India, right? And then we're going to look at the post-colonial situation. I know you all use post-colonial in a different sense. It can be used in a very denoted sense of the period after 1947, but it could also be a connoted sense of ex-colonies not necessarily kind of decolonizing the colonial mindsets, right? So it's also a critical question, right? And you all use it different ways, but I'm just going to use it in both the senses. But and we just can't criticize colonial conservation protection. We can't just criticize post-independence protection and conservation because that assumes that before colonial period there was a golden ecological past, which is just partly true, but we'll talk about it. And after this environmental history, the next plot is question, right? Have we really decolonized? Right? Has conservation in India really decolonized? Has it broken out of imperial shackles, imperial ways of conserving nature? So there we'll talk about why ecology is political and why conservation raises very ethical questions. Right? And after that, finally, I will end with a small discussion on environmental humanities. And it's an invitation to scholars and young students like you all to take up environmental humanities. Yeah. With that, let me go to the first plot point. Let me talk about the Raj. Right? You all have heard about the Raj. To the left are a set of books which is about a general nostalgia for the British. To the right, a set of books, very critical recent books which actually critique the Raj. Right? So talking about the Raj, what happened during the colonial period in India, right? So we exported cotton, raw silk, sugar, and wool, and tea, and coffee, and indigo, right? And the British did this, and they imported finished consumer goods like woolen and cotton and other capital goods like light machinery back to India, right? They manufactured in Britain. They took the raw materials from India, took it to Britain. They manufactured it and sold it at a higher price in India. Now, the renowned, economist Utsa Patnaik, she researched the physical relations between colonial India and Britain, right? And she tried to answer the question. Many Indians are kind of very interested now, have been interested of recently, right? How much money did the British actually take from India? So in her essay, Patnaik in her essay, in a Columbia University press book, said that Britain drained about $45 trillion from India. That's the value now, $45 trillion from India, right? And which hampered India's ability to come out of poverty even today. Okay, British, please understand this, the British did not really develop India. India developed Britain, right? And so before the Crown took over, right, there was the East India Company, the original big corporate, right? And if you read William Dalrymple in his recent book about anarchy, right, the East India Company's anarchy, he calls the period anarchy. He said what you got when the East India Company was ruling was maximum extraction, right? It was a period of great corruption, loot and plunder, and also massive human rights abuse. Now, it was also a period when Indians and Britons were actually collaborating very closely, kind of exploiting and harassing the marginalized India, right? And the country was not conquered by white British manpower alone. It was conquered by Indian troops who were also recruited by the British. And, these armies were actually funded by Western Indian bankers, right? So that's how things were, right? And if you read Shashi Tharoor's book, which is to the right of your screen, right? Now, he says at the beginning of the 18th century, a British economist, Agnes Madison, he had demonstrated that India's share of the world economy was about 23%, right? It was as big as all of Europe put together, right? Earlier in 1700, it was about 27%. And the Emperor Aurangzeb alone, his treasury raked in almost $100 million in tax revenues those days, right? But by the time the British, they left India around 1947, 45, 47, our share of the world economy dipped to just 3% from 27%. And he says the reason was very simple, right? India was governed for the benefit of British. And British rise over the last 200 years was financed by its depredation in India. Now, why am I talking about the Raj is conservation and the forest question is so central to it, right? So key to is the extraction were natural resources from forests, right? A lot of forests were also felled and converted for indigo and tea and coffee plantations, and the revenues went to the British, right? So this is the background. Now, so can you, I keep changing my slide. Hope the slide has changed on your screens. Yeah. Now, so colonial conservation was, it was actually protection for exploitation, right? And you must read this book, right? I'm going to keep giving you book recommendations. And but I also think some of you might have read these books, and sorry if I'm kind of re-posting that book suggestion to you, right? That is a brilliant book by Alfred Crosby, a historian who died a couple of years ago, right? He talks about ecological imperialism, right? So in countries like India, it was military power which helped establishment of power, but in temperate regions where the British went, the British colonized, like Australia, like New Zealand, right? Their expansion was not through military power or economic might. It was through a concept called portmanteau biota, right? So the British took a lot of organisms, minute organisms like diseases, like birds, like sheep, like flowers, like plants, right? And they transplanted Europe in these new colonies, right? But in the tropics like India, right? When you say the tropics, I'm talking about the southern hemisphere, India, Africa, South America, right? There it was trade, military, and politics which helped colonization, right? Just like we were discussing a little earlier about the Raj, right? How the East India Company and later the Crown, how they kind of ruled us. It was through military power, it was through conceit, it was through a lot of politics and exploitation, right? Now in 1864 is what the Indian public intellectual and former environmental historian Ramchandra Guha and his ecologist colleague Dr. Madhav Gadgil what they call as an ecological watershed, right? Because it was that point of time that the forest department was created with German expertise, right? So in the picture to the right is the German and British forester Dietrich Brandis, right? So he, that the Germans were during the Bismarckian Empire, they were the pioneers of scientific forestry, right? And he came and helped the British in India establish forest department. And the forest department, what did they do? They didn't, it was not biodiversity conservation. Biodiversity conservation as a concept, as a paradigm, it emerged only after the Earth Summit in the late 1980s, right? So till then, it was just natural resource exploitation. It was deforestation, right? So the forest department was created around the 1860s, and what was forest? It was not about conservation. It was about scientific forestry. Scientific forestry was what? See, what they did was they actually reduced India's tree diversity. They replaced all biodiversity with in the Western Ghats, in the Himalayas, in central India. They replaced natural old growth forests with useful trees. When I say useful trees, trees which had timber value, right? And they made plantations or monocultures of timber, all right? All biodiverse forests were replaced by monocultural plantations. Now, why did they want this? For example, teak, for example, salwood. Why did they want this? They wanted this for commercial expansion. They wanted this for railway sleepers, right? So you know what a railway sleeper is. So you have those iron tracks and you have the sleepers in between, right? And these railways were important for moving products, right? Agriculture products, indigo, tea, coffee, timber, and whatnot, right? And they moved it to ports, and from the ports you needed ships. So sal and teak were also important for shipbuilding, right? And they took all the resources. They replaced a biodiverse forest with monocultural forests, and that helped railways and maritime transportation, which took all the resources from India to Britain. They added value there, and they came and sold it here at a huge profit market, right? Huge margin, right? And so forest department was created with German enterprise, and commercial forestry was institutionalized, right? You can see the picture there, right? Elephants were used for moving of timber, right? Massive logging. Now, what had happened was most of these forest areas in central India, in the Western Ghats, in the East and West Himalayas were common property resources, right? Local, informal and formal organizations, village level bodies, they had control over resource use, whether it is medicine plants, whether it is timber for fuel wood, whether it's timber for construction, whether it's fodder for pasture, right? All of this, there was a nice, it wasn't very harmonious. India still had a caste system then, but but these natural resources were governed and managed by local communities. But after the institutionalization of Indian forests through the forest department, traditional forest access and use was curtailed. Right? There was massive conflicts. People were protesting. There was massive livelihood losses for pastoralists, for hunter-gatherers, for forest department farmers, etc. Right? And this commercial orientation. So the British conservation had a commercial orientation, right? But this was what Ram Guha and others argued. But there was another, interesting Australian environmental historian. His name was Richard Grove. Now, for about 15 years, he was in a coma after an accident, and he died about 3 years ago, right? You can read his book, I think it was called, I'll give you the name, I forget the name of the book. Maybe after the end of today's talk, I will send a list of readings if you don't have them already, right? So he argued that no, it was not timber alone which lay behind, the British interest in Indian forests, right? Commercial conservation. There was also an ideal basis, because he was saying a lot of Scottish foresters and Scottish doctors that time, they were worried about something called desiccation. Right? Now, what is desiccation? It's an interesting word. Desiccation is the word which describes the act of drying up. Right? So they were saying there was a lot of drought. There was a drying up of Indian lands, and this was because of forest loss, because forests are being felled, and that is why the forest department was also created. Not just the forest department, the general British concern over forests were not just for exploitation, but they also had a worry about desiccation, and they related to drought, and they related drought to deforestation. Right? But there was a big debate. But by and large, I think the Ram Guha school holds a lot of theoretical and political its robustness as a theory, right? So by and large, conservation in the colonial period was about exploitation, right? Now you see that photo to the left on top, right? You have British military men and officials on horses, right? And you also have a lot of hound dogs. I don't know how many dog lovers we have here, right? And it's a very interesting breed, hound dog. These hound dogs would, and that is from my hometown, near my hometown in Ooty, right? In Ooty, we had this recreational backyard called the Lord Wenlock Downs, about 25,000 acres of grasslands. Now it's all run over by wattle and other invasives. But at that point of time, the British they preserved till they left in 47, the Wenlock Downs, because it resembled their home meadows in Britain, right? And because they could do a lot of horse riding on these meadows, on the Wenlock Downs, they could do a lot of jackal hunting, right? They could do a lot of picnicking, right? So even on the one hand, they were exploiting forests in central India and Western Ghats, other parts of Western Ghats and the Himalayas, but in the Nilgiris, which is actually a temperate grassy landscape, it used to be that, they protected the landscape for their own interests because it resembled their homeland, and also they could pursue their amenities, right? So it was everything, it was their interests. So much for colonial conservation. But pre-colonial was not ecologically harmonious, right? So again, I have changed my slide. It is visible. Yeah, right. So you see those old paintings, right? On top is Mughal. I think it is from King Aurangzeb's period, right? They go hunting, right? Elephant back, horseback, bullock carts. And to the bottom, you have a painting of what's supposed to be a Rajput king hunting a rhino, I think. Is it a rhino? Yeah, it looks like a rhino in their kingdom, right? And rhinos are available. They are present in India only in, I think, Assam, right? So maybe the Rajputs were also ruling Assam at that point of time. My history is bad now, right? But you see the paintings, the general idea that there was a lot of hunting going around that time, but not just hunting, right? If you read the works of my good friend and the present vice chancellor of Kriya University and the historian Mahesh Rangarajan, right? He will tell you that no, a lot of scholars like Ram Guha said it was the British who came and ruined India's natural resources and forests. And there was an assumption that before the British came, everything was like honky-dory, it was a harmonious past. But Mahesh Rangarajan kind of disagrees. He said there was massive agrarian expansion in the medieval era, right? So medieval era is like, I think it's from what, 6th, 8th century, almost till the 15th century, right? 15th, 14th century. And beyond the 16th century, right? For example, he says in one of his works that there was a massive fragmentation of elephant habitat between Gujarat and central India, and elephants could not move as a wild mammalian species, right? And there was also a big expansion of arable land for revenue, right? Both the Mughal and Indian kings, they wanted revenue, right? And they destroyed massive expanses of forests to grow paddy and other crops, right? Early varieties of paddy and other crops. So that not just for food security, but you can earn revenue, right? And that's how you run a country. Now, a lot of nomadic people, for example, near Punjab, were sedentarized. You know who nomadic people are, right? The people who move about with livestock, with buffaloes, with sheep, with goats, with camels, right? And for the longest time, pastoral people, nomadic people have been the enemies of the settled agrarian state, right? Because you couldn't collect revenue from pastoral people, right? You couldn't get a grip on these guys. So they were really harassed and they were sedentarized, put in one place. Now, even in, you know, you all have heard of Nalanda University, right? It's built, you know, one of the oldest universities in Bodh Gaya, right? A place I always want to visit. I haven't, but even there, the seminary, the Buddhist seminary of Bodh Gaya, it seems they cleared in the 1500s massive thousands of acres of forest for cultivation, right? So it was Hindu kings, it was Mughals, it was Buddhists who were clearing land in the medieval period, right? And a lot of Hindu rulers, they encouraged the agrarian settlement, you know, from the heartland to the hinterlands of Middle India, right? And they want to settle. People, again, it was not settling to cultivate. Maybe there was a bit of food security, but also it was also for revenue, right? And in the in Madhya Pradesh, right, you had what you called old jungle mahals, right, which were just good old forests, right? They were reclaimed by the Maratha Peshwa kings, right, for revenue, right? So here is the thing. So the British came. 1864 was an ecological watershed, but that does not mean that the pre-colonial period was ecological golden age. In comparison, it is a golden age, right? But in comparison, what the British did, but there was massive environmental change, especially when the agrarian frontier kind of was conquered from the heartland to the hinterlands, right? So there was environmental change in the pre-colonial period too. Yeah. So what about the post-colonial period, the post-independence period? Yeah. I have changed my slide. It is visible. Yeah. Yeah. So the post-colonial conservation was also, you know, about exploitation. It was about protection for exploitation, right? Now, if you read Ramghar's book, yeah, sorry, This Fissured Land, and the book which kind of came after that sequel, you know, about India's ecological past and presence, right? He says there was a definite material context to conflicts. There were conflicts when the British ruled because they took over common property resources and they converted old growth forests, which were useful for people, into monoculture plantations. There were, you know, people who protested, people burnt down these plantations, and that continued in the post-colonial, the post-independence period of, right? Right. So if you look at, so there's a distinct class element, a distinct class character to natural resource conflicts, right? And these conflicts had a certain sequence, a proper sequence. There was resource shortage because of one, fencing the forests so that people don't, you know, exploit them, use them. Two, converting useful natural resource bases to monocultural plantations. Okay, there was a resource shortage because of that. And the state, so what happened when the British left? You could say, I might sound a little radical, that a process of internal colonization happened, right? So when the British left, I know Pandit Nehru was talking about, you know, building India and development and all that. But the class of people who got benefits were rich farmers and industrialists, right? And they had a lot of access to India's natural resources, right? So 1947 to, you know, to till about, I would say 1985, 1990, right? Because there was a paradigm shift from commercial exploitation of forests, biodiversity conservation. So till about mid 90s, the paradigm was clearly exploitation. And a lot of this exploitation, who benefited from that? The industrialists like Tatas and Birlas and rich farmers and old zamindari families, right? And so when you had these resource shortages, they were kind of privileged, you know, and there was a lot of pollution because of this industrial production in the post-independence period. And it's not that all the benefits, economic benefits, it trickled down to poor people, right, in India, right? So a lot of people from the post-independence period, they had to leave the rural areas and come to urban areas, right, for labor, and it continues, right? And so the local public all over India, whether it's Western Ghats or Central India or Himalayas, they were protesting such resource exploitation. A lot of conflicts in the post-independence period, right? And a lot of media coverage happened in the 1980s, especially after the state of environment citizens reports brought about by the late Arun Agarwal, right? He founded the organization, the Center for Science and Education, right? Science and Environment in Delhi, right? And after those citizen science reports, there was a lot of media coverage. But one particular conflict which caught the nation's attention was the Chipko movement, right? Because it was most representative. It was symbolically loaded. It was the Himalayas, right? And a lot of Indians venerate the Himalayas. Himalayas are the holy origins of the Ganga, right? A holy river for India, right? And if local people in the Himalayas were given a bad deal, right? If their old deodar forest trees were exploited because the rights were given to some sports company to make cricket bats or even shuttle rackets, right? I think that was the case. So a lot of these women went and hugged the trees and said, we won't let you, fell these big old growth deodar trees, right? So this caught the nation's attention, right? Chipko was a big turning moment in India's environmental movement history, right? So later, about 15 years later, the Western Ghats movement, it was all inspired by the Chipko movement, right? And the Chipko was most representative of, if you listen to scholars of India's conservation conflict history, right? Because the language of class was very, very opposite, right? It was rich versus poor. It was poor nomads, poor peasants, poor hunter-gatherers, poor fisher folk against rich trawlers, against rich timber companies, right? So the language of class was very, very prominent. It was rich versus poor. There was resource exploitation and dispossession, right? And the state gave preferential treatment. It was always the, in riverbanks, in riverine context, it was the Dalits who suffered, right? In forests, it was indigenous people who suffered, right? And what people tried to do, they took recourse to direct action, like women there hugging trees, but also more organized protests like the Western Ghats movement, like the Chipko movement, right? So even in Karnataka, or your home state, inspired by Sundarlal Bahuna, the sage of environmentalism in India, his work in the Himalayas, one of his disciples, Pandurang Hegde, you can Google for him. He started the Apiko movement, which is also in Kannada, I think, the act of hugging trees, right, in the Western Ghats, right? So, the pre-colonial period was okay. It wasn't a golden age for ecological harmony. There was a lot of environmental transformation. The colonial period was the ecological watershed, massive exploitation, conservation, not of biodiversity of any of those things. It was protection of forests so that you could protect timber, and timber is useful for industry, right? And in the post-independence period, we did not decolonize. Our mindset did not. We were still colonial in our mindset. It was still exploiting our forests, right? So the even in official forestry, the paradigm was commercial felling. Okay, that was what forests were till about the mid 1980s, and then you had the Forest Protection Act, and then slowly, the paradigm shifted towards, you need to conserve forests for biodiversity, and all of this, it was a chain of events, a sequence of events, right? You had the Earth Day, you had environmental protests in India, then later you had the Earth Summit in Paris, right? Then you had the Convention of Biological Diversity, and then India was a signatory to the Biodiversity Convention, and slowly, biodiversity is the paradigm for conservation today, right? We're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about genetic level diversity, we're talking about species level diversity, we're talking about habitat level diversity. Right? But having said that, ever since Manmohan Singh he liberalized India in 1993, 94, 92, 94, there's been, especially over the last 2 decades during the BJP's rule, there's been massive biodiversity loss, right? There's also been this big idea to kind of link rivers, and a lot of old growth forests are going to be inundated by these linking of rivers, right? And the agriculture front also, there's a big agrarian crisis in India. People on the one hand, there's a lot of the state is removing itself from the welfare state is moving away from supporting farmers in terms of minimum procurement prices. There's also a fertilizer procurement crisis, but there's also agriculture in India is also, since the Green Revolution, it has been very, very pesticide and chemical heavy, right? And Punjab is the capital of cancer in India, right? Because of massive pesticide use, right? So agricultural diversity is also in a decline, right? Forests are being replaced, the land use changes are massive, right? And there is a huge crisis. There is also a development crisis in India, as you know. We don't need to talk about it. There's a conservation crisis, and on top of that, we have climate change, right? So it is we are living in very, very tough times, right? So much for conservation. So again, the question of, has conservation decolonized? Let's talk about conservation as an idea, right? Today, you and me want to talk about protecting tigers. We want to talk about protecting elephants. We want, we have massive campaigns by the CNN IBN channel, by NDTV channel on why tiger protection is very important, right? As urban people, we think, oh, tigers are dying. Of course, tiger numbers were dipping in India, and now they've really come back. They've really bounced back after Project Tiger, right? But what about people who live in or near forests, people who graze in pastoral lands, right? What about them, right? So let's talk a bit about, over the next 10 minutes, about the politics of ethics and conservation, right? And again, it is a teaching today. I'm talking about politics. Everything's political, right? So you have a subject called political ecology. I don't know if you've heard about it, right? This particular subject, a lot of my colleagues in ATREE, they work on the subject, though I focus on environmental justice, which is more policy and law oriented, but political ecology is about power, right? They are saying the subject of ecology, the subject of conservation biology is too apolitical, right? So political ecology, it deals with the material and discursive. When I say discursive, the discourses, okay? The material and discourse struggles around nature, right? When you talk about material struggles about nature, what examples come to your mind, right? For example, now if you want to notify a reserve forest as a protected area, as a wildlife sanctuary, or as a national park, what do? You try to extinguish the local Adivasis' rights, right? Adivasi who's lived there for ages and ages, right? And ecology goes about, because ecology as a discipline was an import from the temperate northern countries. Conservation biology was a concern. It was a crisis discipline which was imported from America and Europe to India, right? And they think, yes, most of the biodiversity wealth in the world is in the tropical south, but they think these are like Edenic gardens, as if there are no people inside, as if people's history of use is not implicated in the structure and function of these forests, of these tropical forests, right? So in criticizing this apolitical nature of ecology, political ecology emerged, right? But broadly, environmental social sciences and environmental justice scholars and environmental anthropologists and environmental sociologists and historians, they criticize ecology and conservation biology, or the conservation paradigm, right? And when I say paradigm, the core of the paradigm, the flagship basis of this paradigm is the protected area, right? So you know what a protected area is. Again, it's a national park or a wildlife sanctuary, right? And we have hundreds of these protected areas in India, right? In Karnataka, you have Kudremukh, Nagarhole, you have Bandipur. In my state, in Tamil Nadu, we have Mukurthi, we have Mudumalai, we have Kalakad Mundandarai. You've heard of Jim Corbett National Park. You've heard of the Great Himalayan National Park. These are national parks, right? So it's an idea which was also, it emerged from an ideology of wilderness or deep ecology in America, right? A lot of you all may have read the works of Henry David Thoreau and John Muir and others, right? So these are romanticists, kind of romantic folks who thought of nature as a very pristine space, as if there are no people living inside, right? So this ecology it's apolitical. It's insensitive to local cultures. But what are its major tenets? One is pristinity, right? Pristinity. All of you all think forests are very pristine, right? It's like Eden. It's like Eden. It's like all those pictures you see in old paintings, right? Edenic paintings, right? But there is a problem with that, right? And as scholars, you must be very critical, and you must be, you must open your eyes to the fact, right? About pristinity, right? Now, there was a recent paper published, I think 3 days ago, right? It is in the journal of PNAS, right? The PNAS is nothing but the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, a very, very prestigious journal. So here, a couple of 2 or 3 social scientists and ecologists, they got together, right? Earl Ellis, Nicholas Gauthier, and you can Google for it. I'll send you the link. So the topic of the title of the article is of the research article is that people have shaped most of terrestrial nature for at least 12,000 years. Right? And let me take 2 minutes to read the abstract of that of this paper. Right? They say the current biodiversity crisis is often depicted as a struggle to preserve untouched habitats. Here we combine, they say, global maps of human populations and land use over the past 12,000 years with current biodiversity data to show that nearly 3/4 of terrestrial nature, terrestrial is land, okay? Terrestrial nature has long been shaped by diverse histories of human habitation and use by indigenous and traditional peoples. With rare exceptions, current biodiversity losses are caused not
Deepak sir, I think there is some connectivity issues. So we'll wait for the speaker to get back. And thank you for your patience.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You wait, sir.
over 2,000-3,000 years by firing and grazing of the local Toda pastoralists. Right? So they were responsible for maintaining this grassland over thousands and thousands of years. Right? But sometimes we think this Chola grassland complex is a very natural one. Now it's a different question that after the British plantation policy, it's been invaded by wattle and gorse and a lot of pine and eucalyptus plantation, right? But the earlier story, the grasslands were kind of maintained, by the Todas who used to burn this during every monsoon so that you have more grass. So human labor is involved in shaping a forest or shaping a grassland. Right? Now that, first of all, ecologists don't talk about. And they also deny local rights, right? The material conflicts, right? So when you notify a forest, right, you tend to extinguish the rights of people and you kind of resettle them elsewhere, right? Adivasis. And you've heard about Adivasi conflicts and protests in the Nilgiri Hills in Orissa, in struggles in Chhattisgarh, all over, right? You read about it, right? So this apolitical ecology, this old world kind of conservation science, which is responsible for a lot of wrong-headed policies in India, forest policies, conservation policies in India. They propagated the pristinity myth. They effaced the human labor and they denied justice to local people. Right? But also look at the ethics of it, right? So a lot of conservation science and ecology is very descriptive. They want to describe a marine ecosystem. They want to describe, habitat level diversity in a forest, right? They want to describe a grassland ecosystem. But at the end of the paper, at the end of the report, they will give you prescription. They start with description. They'll give you prescription. Now, what is prescription? The usual thing. This is a very important habitat. It's a very pristine habitat. We need to resettle people from there. But these people have been living there. They shaped that forest and grassland for millennia, right? So they also tend to be very prescriptive. It's an ethically, morally fraught issue, right? And a lot of these ideas behind conservation in India have the origins in America, the deep ecology movement, the wilderness ideal, right? And I say, right, if you look at my point, the last point, I'm talking about deep ecology and wilderness ideal under utilitarian garb. Now, what is utilitarianism, right? See, there is one gentleman, now his ghost, it haunts India's forests for the last 300 years, 200 years. His name is Jeremy Bentham, right? He's the father of utilitarianism, right? And you would know him by his very famous site, his adage that maximum happiness for the maximum number of people. Right? So who are the utilitarians? They talk about utility of a public good or a resource. They say a forest, for example, protect Bandipur or Nagarhole or the Great Himalayan National Park is a public good. We need to notify it as a national park. We need to kick people out because we are protecting the biodiversity here for the greater national good. All of India will be happy. All of India will benefit, right? But the people, the pastoralists and the hunter foragers and the forest edge farmers, they've been using and shaping these forests for millennia, right? But their rights or their happiness does not count. It's always the happiness, of the greater common. Who's the greater common? It's the urban people in India, right? So a lot of conservation is very utilitarian. A lot of Western conservationists, they push this idea that it is good to conserve pristine nature. It is for India's greater good. But behind that is deep ecological thinking, which is very biocentric, which is, forests were always pristine. They evolved by themselves. People came and occupied them later. They are a big danger to it. I don't want to send out a wrong message saying, no, you must open up India's forests and they can be destroyed. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying cultural and natural histories have always been intertwined, right? It is an interaction. What we see as forests today is a history of interaction between nature and people, right? So conservation in India has not decolonized. If you look at a lot of conservation ideas and thinking in Africa, South America, and India, it is very, very first world. It's very, very white. It's very, very deep ecological, right? But because of these policies, a lot of people, be it Todas of the Nilgiris, be it the Maasai of East Africa, be it the Balinese of Indonesia, they suffer because of this colonial type of deep ecology conservation policies. Conservation can thrive. Biodiversity can be safeguarded if local communities and also us urban middle class folks, upper class folks, we can have a dialogue if we believe in participatory democracy, if we believe in procedural justice that is involving local people in conservation decision making. If we believe in distributional justice, that is if we believe in distributing natural resources equitably, right? So no, we're not decolonized. We have a long way to go. We need to decolonize in both the conservation and development thinking. Right now, before I conclude, right? So, like I said, massive suffering, climate change. We've been suffering from climate change. It's gradual, so we don't realize. But we have this thing called the pandemic, and people are dropping dead around us like ninepins, right? It's such an existential crisis. Personally, I'm numb. I can't even think. I can't emote. I'm really shocked behind words. But we're humans, and we are not just biological beings, right? We're all literature students, right? We have language. That's how we communicate. We have language. That's how we communicate. So you have philosopher Nietzsche, his famous quote, "We have art in order not to die of the truth," right? Another version of this is, "We have art in order not to die of science," right? We can't, these are hard facts. Yes, pandemic and climate change are hard facts, but and the virus and its DNA structure, all these are hard facts, but let us not, we need science to understand that, but let's not let science and facts destroy us, right? We have art, we have language, we have history, we have English literature, we have Tamil and Kannada literature, so that we don't die of the truth, right? And then we have to the bottom, I think you recognize her, right? I think you have her books for your reading, right? Toni Morrison, the Nobel laureate, right? We die, she says. That may be the meaning of life. Right? We die of old age, we die of heart attacks, we die of cancer, we die of pandemic, right? But that may be the meaning of life, but we do language. That may be the measure of our lives, right? So we need to communicate with ourselves about the conservation crisis. We need to communicate about human histories. We need to communicate about the mutual fates of nature and culture, right? And that's one platform which a lot of your English literature students might be interested in, and also a lot of other, economics and psychology and sociology students might be interested in. It's called environmental humanities, right? So here you see, I've listed a certain number of topics. These are actually titles of a volume series which the Rachel Carson Center publishes. Okay, you can go to the website, and it's called the Perspectives publication, right? And look at the titles of their perspective volumes, right? Women and Energy, New Histories of Pacific Whaling, right? And Slow Hope. How nice is that word, slow hope, right? You can only have slow hope, like slow food. I mean, we can't have urgent hope. Rethinking ecologies of crisis. Now, can nature have rights, right? Legal and political insights about, can nature have rights? And there's a big, these ethical, dialogues in India. About 3 years ago, a judge in Uttarakhand, he declared the river as a person, right? It was a very interesting moment, right? The men and nature, hegemonic masculinities and environmental change, right? A lot of reason for our destruction of nature is because of patriarchy and masculinities, right? Unruly environments, and that's a book I edited some time back for Rachel Carson Center, right? It was about the ecologies of agency in the global era. The other thing, out of sight, out of mind, the politics of culture of waste, right? And the Anthropocene, the age of humans, right? So this gives you a sense of how we can talk and think and communicate about nature, right? And environmental humanities is an interdisciplinary platform involving environmental philosophy, environmental ethics, English literature, environmental anthropology, environmental history, cultural writing, literary writing, right? This interdisciplinary platform is very, very important in making sense of crisis and creating hope for the future, right? So we can have a separate talk, maybe later, a class on environmental humanities, but I would encourage students here, and they're good professors and teachers, to actually start thinking about an environmental humanities initiative in Christ University, and I will be happy to help you with my networks on, right? And yes, so much for a long history of conservation, and whether colonial background, history of conservation, whether we've decolonized in terms of conservation thinking, what conservation has meant in the post-independence period, and then the ethics and politics of conservation, right? And I hope it was a big story. I know there's a lot to grapple, but today's Earth Day, and when the Earth Day began, they borrowed from the wartime technique of a teaching, and I wanted today to be a teaching. I wanted today to be about power. I want today to be about politics, because the current environmental and political situation we live in, we need to know that everything is political in terms of power relations, in terms of justice, right? And I'm not here to radicalize you. I think all of you all are sensitive to things, but I just wanted to use conservation to have a larger, a very humane dialogue on the human condition. Yeah. So Yeah, I don't know what time I've taken.
It's okay, Dr. Siddharth.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for this masterful talk. Actually, I was about to use the Walter Benjaminian term storytelling. Uh, and it was a paint painted on a very large canvas. Took a lot of time periods, historical moments, conceptual elements in its wake. And as I think Walter Benjamin says one at some point of time, probably in the storyteller, that the power of the story relies not only on the tale but on the teller. And I think that is one of the instances which we just witnessed, and we couldn't have asked for a better teaching for the occasion. I think I'll just try and make a couple of points and then go to the questions which are already coming up in the chat box. I would also ask the audience to put their questions in the chat box so that we can take it one by one. One of the things through which you ended your talk was the whole question of interdisciplinarity. Now, it's almost like that thing which everyone talks about, which but no one knows how does it basically looks and how it is to be done. And when you were giving your talk, I was just taken back to some of the very fundamental questions which humanities raises or social sciences raises, and so on and so forth. And it just seems to me that no question can be looked without the ecological question at its core of its formulation. I was just reading a few years back the marvelous book called The Late Victorian Holocaust by Mike Davis, and how actually global climate change has defined our history, so to speak. And without that, I don't think Dipesh Chakravarti's work would have been possible to a great extent. Also, the recent work on migration, for example, the very well written, I think in the reading list we can put it there as well, Sunil Amrit's Crossing the Bay of Bengal, where he's giving the whole political economy of ecology, so to speak. How rice was used to pay for tea, and how tea was used to pay for opium, and how this agrarian network, so to speak, evolves. The problem, though, I think, and this is where I think environmental humanities and scholars of environmental humanities such as you have to grapple, is how do we see it analytically? It's on a phenomenological level, it's easy to see that one question is related to another. And it's also clear that one discipline does not have the answers very clearly. But once we are formulating the question analytically and methodologically, how do we do that? And I think my own sense is that we are still at a very nascent stage, and talkings and teachings such as these are important points of conversation where we can actually grapple with those questions as to how do we look the question of ecology, economy, so on and so forth, analytically and methodologically. So that was something which just struck me very, very strongly and powerfully while you were making your presentation. I'll start taking up the questions. The first question is by Dr. Abhaya NB, and she writes, when we think of decolonization, replacing the contemporary practice with indigenous practices is popular. This is linear and easy approach to follow, which also gives a comfort zone to inhabit. How do we imagine a different decolonizing practice with a moral, ethical compass at the center? And it follows by, in the context of bushfire, the Australian government is defending integrating Aboriginal practices as creating an inclusive society and honoring knowledge system. So
absolutely. But that, so there are many ways, methods through which we can decolonize, and interdisciplinarity is one of them, right? Where we can, disciplinarity itself is a colonial heritage, right? Disciplinary silos. And we need to break that, right? So as literature students, as sociologists, as geologists, and environmental scientists, right, we can get together and, for example, talk about fire. Like fire, the British didn't like because it was destroying their teak and sal. right? But natural forest fires have been happening in Mudumalai. Mudumalai is not, if you're passed through it, is not, it's never a forest, it's a tea plantation now. Right? At one point of time, fires used to sweep Mudumalai. Fires used to sweep the upper Himalayas, the Deodar forest. Fires used to sweep the upper Nilgiris, right? But the British used this fire service mentality and they wanted to keep their plantation safe, and they criminalized fire, right? But fire was a medium of interaction between nature and people, between, agrarian communities, pastoralists and others, and their ecosystems, right? And they reproduce nature, right? But now the problem is you made everything monocultural. A lot of invasive species are there. There's too much of fuel load, right? And now if the fire comes, it'll destroy everything, right? So you can't use the current situation of ecosystems to actually criminalize fire, historically, right? But you can still experiment with fire, like in the Australian case, right? So many years back, me and my colleague, my student Bharat Sundaram, we worked in the Nilgiri Rangasamy Hills. We're looking at Sholiga local knowledge on fires, right? And they would tell you that fire was like a man, shaving annually, right? So when we set fire to the forest, it was like you had a clean shave, and then you have a luxuriant growth of beard, right? And they followed that for millennia, right? And there was no loss of biodiversity because of that, right? And so there are ways. Fire is just one instance of one way we can decolonize, get out of a colonial mindset. There are many ways. How you think about conservation, how you think about development, right? But having said that, we also live in a very global world. We can't go back to a very reactionary traditional past, right? If you look at traditional India, it's very dangerous because it's very hierarchical and stratified, right? And there's a lot of mumbo jumbo there. So we can't revive all that in the name of decolonization or decolonizing mindsets.
Okay. So the next question is by Dr. Abhilash, and he writes, we have certain historical accounts of disenfranchised communities, defeated people forced to run away to live in the forests and mountains, and how they continue to live there and turned into forest dwellers, and then finally became the tribes as they are known now. Do you agree with this theory of tribals as defeated minorities of the past? And should we then reintegrate them or let them hold on to their spaces?
There's a very controversial book by one of my favorite political scientists, James E. Scott, right? And for my PhD, I used his work, Seeing Like a State, my work on forest conflicts in the Nilgiri Wayanad. But later then he went on to wrote a book which I don't really agree with he used the example of Bhutan and Burma, I think kind of argued, I forget the book's name, that people were always
I think it was a Zomia land. That was the book, weapons of the book.
See, I always so in the Nilgiris, I belong to a peasant community called the Badagas. The Badagas have recently got an indigenous status, though anthropologists say they came from Karnataka when the Vijayanagara Empire broke up, right? And so everyone wants to say, no, the Todas were original, then the Badagas came. We always were on the hills, right? I always joke. So when in that particular geologic age, when the Western Ghats erupted, nobody was sitting on that, right? The mountains came first and someone always came up later, right? So even if you look at the Todas of the Nilgiris, one of the most ethnographically recorded people in anthropological history, there are records that they either came up from the Coimbatore Plains or the Palghat Plains or the Wayanad Plains, and they came up with the buffaloes, right? Over 3,000 or 4,000 years, over millennia, right? And there's evidence for that. So using this long-term kind of a frivolous kind of framing, yes, when the Himalayas and Western Ghats erupted, there was no one on top. People always went on top. They climbed on top. But later, but also it's very important to establish links between Adivasis and indigenous people on mountains and the plains. They never lived an isolated, romantic, inclusive life. They always had some kind of a trade exchange with the plains. Sometimes the exchange was painful. It could be, it could have been raids. It could have been persecuting people, right? And they went off, but that exchange was always there. But yes, I think that question does hold some historical water, that people went to the hills at some point of time for various reasons. It could be a push reason, it could be a pull reason, right? And because there was I can't imagine that there were always mountains and there were people always there, like in mountain biogeography.
Thank you for that. Actually, I was also reminded of the origin stories of the Nagas and the Meiteis, and they have the same story, of the hill people and the valley people interacting. And there's something there. I think some of the students would be inspired to do research on that as well. We have two questions. One is by Ananya Sangameshwar, and the question is, what would be your idea of a decolonized ecology? And maybe related to that also is by Semanti Chakladar. What is the significance of studying our ecological history? And do you think it is a deliberate attempt to not teach environmental history to students of our age? What can be done to integrate indigenous, in parentheses, Adivasi practices into mainstream forest conservation?
Uh, very interesting questions, very relevant questions. Sorry, the first question was about what was that about? The first question about
Decolonized ecology. Decolonized ecology.
The very stuff of today's conversation we had over conservation, right? On the one hand, you need to give a lot of choice and opportunity and legislative powers, legislated rights to local communities, right? To have a say in conservation. At the same time, we should not romanticize these communities and say they have to live there forever, dancing around trees and holding the tiger's tail and singing, right? They should be like you and me. They should have the opportunity to come down to the plains and join Infosys or join ATREE and Christ University, right? So we must build that platform of rights for them, take into account their aspirations, but at the same time, use both, not the traditional, but why do we assume that people on the hills and Adivasis are only traditional? Don't they have modern rationality sensibilities? Right? For example, when the Todas were burning the grasses of the Nilgiri upper plateau, it was a very logical, rational thing. If you burn the grass before monsoon, you'll have more grass. If you have more grass, your buffalo population will thrive. If you have more population, you'll have more milk. If you have more milk, you can have it, your barter economy will increase. It was rational thinking. So let's not romanticize this traditional knowledge. It's very dangerous too, right? That's one way, right? And there's a lot of, in the interdisciplinary kind of forum in environmental social sciences, in ATREE, we had a lot of these dialogues about what there's two ways. One is we need the ecology itself. People are saying a lot of species that the British planted are invasives, right? Like wattle, like goss, like lantana. But for example, in the Nilgiris, I grew up with the eucalyptus trees and the, and cypress trees, and there's also this ethical question, right? So how long should it take for a tree to get a visa, right? To get citizenship, right? And then, but we need to look at the ecological consequences in terms of water tables, in terms of biodiversity, etc. So it's not. There's no such thing of going back to a pristine past. How long can we keep going back? 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years? Right? That's absurd. We can't go back to Eden. We need to have a balance somewhere. And the other question was about environmental history. No, I don't think it's been hidden. Environmental history, in fact, has been, the most thriving of environmental humanities disciplines in India, right? And I think, after Ram Guha's work, his work was actually a work of historical sociology of the Chipko movement, but it ushered in a huge, massive wave of environmental history work in India, especially around forests, especially in the colonial period. But now there's been environmental histories of rivers, about the pre-colonial period, about the colonial, post-colonial period, right? There's a lot of work happening there. But environmental history or environmental anthropology or environmental sociology or environmental ethics, all of these are also threatened like our biodiversity species nowadays in the current political situation, right? On the one hand, arts and humanities are being being looked down upon. The funds are being cut for research. At the same time, certain type of sciences which kind of build skills, like just pure engineering sciences, are being given priority. So I think both we need a solidarity between the social sciences, the environment, the humanities, and also the sciences in taking India forward, right? Otherwise, at the rate we are going in, we are going back to the medieval period. So it's a big struggle, right? And there'll be a lot of effort to poo-poo or kind of look down or even kind of thwart subjects, critical subjects like environmental history or environmental psychology or environmental sociology. It's a big battle now, and I thought, and we're talking about interdisciplinarity of sharing methods in theory, but we also need to share our politics and have solidarity now, and then going past our current political climate and whatever pandemic crisis.
Thank you, Dr. Siddharth. Deepak sir, I think we can close now. Is it? I'll just thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. If there are no more questions,
Okay.
yes, we may end the.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Siddharth, for this this talk and then taking on the questions and replying to them. Thank you for taking the time. And it only goes to show, I think, why a young generation who are now identified as students have perhaps a larger role to play. And maybe the success of this talk and teaching would also lie in maybe some of the students thinking of taking up some research, but there's a lot of work to be done. Chipko movement, for example, is one, but Koel Karo project in Jharkhand and all of those industrial wasteland which has been created as a result of state intervention, that needs its historians, that needs its anthropologists, needs its literary scholars. So I thank you so much on behalf of the Ecological Diversity Cell, Dr. Siddhartha Krishnan, and the audience for asking such important questions. Formally, I would like to thank Dr. Shobana P. Matthews, head of the Department of English and Cultural Studies, Central Campus. I also would like to thank Dr. John J. Kennedy, the Dean, for enabling of these schools to function. And personally, I would like to thank Dr. Deepak Sarvanan for allowing me to moderate this session. I learned a lot. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to the audience. Deepak sir, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, sir. I think we may end the session now. Yeah, if we don't have any
Thanks,
questions. Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you, Siddharth sir, for.
Thank you all. It's been wonderful, wonderful.